This is me and Sally again in a new session where we continue what we started. The last time we talked a little bit about handling exceptions. We talked a little bit about, how exceptions can be handled differently. We talked about the catch-all kind of exceptions, which are things that engineers that are developing the software may or may not be aware of, kind of a catch-all kind of thing. And then we ventured a little bit into the situation where other tests would be failing, and these tests would be failing because, we are supposed to handle everything a little bit differently. And Sally, I remember last time you and I had a little, assignment about being able to fix the failing tests. So do you wanna share your screen and tell people what the solution is for that, and maybe if you have any questions? All right.
Isn't my solution on your screen?
Yeah, that's it right there. So basically you went in, yep, funny. So let me take this one out here. Nice. Okay, been a long day. Okay, perfect. So yeah, so what you did basically was, the last time, just for people who didn't see this before, we went and added this and we said take in that exception and call it book service exception. So we localized that exception. There's another layer of localization that I will talk about in a bit, but this is just the start. When we did this, Sally and I, last time, when we start running the test, it made the test that we've written originally pass, but these other two tests failed. Why? Because these other two tests are expecting a different kind of wrapping other than a book service exception. So for now, we went and said because these tests are expecting these tests here are expecting to just throw the exact same exception, we're just gonna go ahead, just like you did, Sally, here. This is a perfect handling, to basically go and say, nope, just throw the same exception. Handling, take it and throw it again. Why throw it again? Because we don't want it to fall into this one here, right? Okay. I'm gonna add a little bit on top of that, but I'm gonna, first ask you, do you have any questions about any of that? Anything at all in here?
Yeah,
But
I think I asked like, the exception is a mother, so I was expected to cover invalid book exception and no book exception.
right.
What you have to call them separately, basically.
Right. So just for the people that, watching us,
Mhm.
Sally's basically saying if this guy can catch everything, this is the mother exception because everything inherits from this, right? Why do we have to do this at all? Why can't we just let it handle it, internally? And the answer here is that we want to basically handle each and every one of those in a different way than the way we handled this one. So here we decided to wrap it up in a service exception, you know, instead. And you'll see a lot of people do this. You'll see a lot of people go and say, well, if this exception, right, that type, right, equal type of null book exception like this. That's a
Mhm.
horrible way of handling exceptions. Don't do that. That's just really a poor way of expressing a thought through code. Expressing a thought through code is art, just like poetry, right? You can write something really garbage, or you can write something that's really cool. So it all depends on the good thing here is that programming languages will give you that kind of capacity to be able to go and say, yeah, you can handle things differently and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so this code drop, just remove empty line. Just a quick thing I'm doing here, so this guy can go there. And then here's what we're gonna do today. You see how we are picking up and throwing the same exception like this?
Mhm.
These exceptions also need to be categorized, right? Let me just remind you here of a couple of things. This is exactly, for the people that watched a previous sessions, Ta'arafu sessions, they will be able to relate to this. But let me just show you here. I'm gonna open up the Blackboard here, and I'm just gonna share with you some ideas. And hopefully you'll find these ideas interesting and exciting. So let me go up in here and let me create a new black screen. Here you go. Okay, so here's the deal. If this is your application, let's just imagine that this is your foundation service, right? Your foundation service actually does two layers of work when it comes to exceptions, right? The exception itself that is being thrown can either be can be homegrown, meaning that it's an origin exception. The exception can be external, and an exception can be native. It can be native. What does that even mean? Like, I'm gonna call this local, external, and native. Two of these we don't like, and one of these we really, really like. Now, bear with me because this is where it gets very interesting. If this is your foundation service in here, and your foundation service in here is going and saying, my job is to be able to map anything that's red, any non-local models into their localized models, the foundation service does two things. This exception that's localized, it will categorize it. So it will pick up this localized exception as is, like this. It will say, okay, you're in good state. I don't need to localize you because you're already localized. And then I'm gonna map you into into something that I call categorization exception. What's a categorization exception? Just like when we said service exception. When you say service exception, that's a categorization. So this is categorized. Now, with these two guys here, there's a different trip that we need to take, right? It's not as simple. For these two guys, they first require localization and then they require categorization. So these guys take a little bit of a longer trip in here. So they go like this, and we basically say, nope, map this into local exception first, and then map this into a category. So localization, categorization. Don't worry, I'll give you an example in a second in here. Okay. Localize, categorize, localize, categorize. Why categorize? Because there are so many different local exceptions that your service can throw, and we don't want to throw all of these to be if we want to handle them in terms of categories, we don't want that to happen the way it's being done today. The way you go and say, oh, maybe it inherits for this particular class or any of that. All of that is just creating chaos in code and makes it hard to maintain. Okay. Now remember this shape very well because this is really, really important because this is literally the main drive for any work that a foundation service is doing. Okay. What's an example of that stuff? What's an example of this work that we're doing here? I'll tell you in a second. So any service here, let's take an example of an external exception. Let's say you're using something like a library called SendGrid. SendGrid. SendGrid is a library that helps engineers send emails, basically. Emails, text messages, stuff like that. So I need to have my app be able to have a broker, and this broker will offer functionality that will help me kind of send emails through SendGrid, right? This library here, let me show you what this library does. This library here can offer particular capabilities. If I go like this and say SendGrid C# exceptions like this, here you go. You'll find a bunch of exceptions. Let me see here, their documentation. Let's see. They have their exceptions documented. Documentations is always a is a problem when it comes to, let's see here. If we go into their source and then we go into SendGrid, we should probably see their exceptions that they're throwing somewhere in here, I would hope. Helpers, event hook errors, error handler. There, see, they have their own exceptions, right? So they will throw something like SendGrid error response, or they will send something like service not available exception or request error exception, whatever they have. They have their own little exceptions in here, right? So let's pick up one that has SendGrid name on it, so we can basically work with it. Let's just say SendGrid error response or something, right? let's say we're getting this guy here, and this guy here is not a native or local model. So we're using SendGrid, and all of a sudden this exception happens. SendGrid error response or SendGrid error exception. So this is the guy coming in here. That's SendGrid exception. Now we need to deal with that. This SendGrid exception that's happening in here, it becomes immediately an external error, right? We need to localize this guy, meaning that we need to take that exception as SendGrid and turn it into something that's more formatted and more modularized, something that we can control. So we can map this into email service exception, right? Or something like email failed email exception. See, the localization always keeps some sort of a generic language, and it keeps us that sort of generic language intentionally. So it kind of abstracts away what underlying technology we're working with when it comes to sending emails. So this becomes a failed email exception, and then we turn this into, if the entity that we're working with is a student or whatever, then we go and say this is a dependency exception. The same thing happens with native exceptions. We receive something like a generic exception like this, something like Stack Overflow exception, or just an exception, a generic exception like this. And we go and say we need to localize this guy, right? So we can go here and say, failed, right? Um, uh, let's say failed service exception like this. And then we take that guy and map it into service exception. So this is localization and this is categorization. And the localization is much more, there's plethora of localization versus categorization. The whole reason really we're doing categorization is because we want to be able to control the amount of exceptions that are coming out of a particular service. So what other categories that can come out of this? There is a dependency validation exception. That's a category. There is also another category that's called a validation exception. Validation exception like this. Validation exception like this. See, these are the only four categories. There are actually really three, but there is one that just stays in the middle like this between the dependency and the validation exception, but we just keep it like this, right? These are the four categories, but out of these categories, you can have so many different localized exceptions. You could have like invalid student exception. We could have something like not found student exception. That's a validation. We could have null student exception. All of these are localized. All of these. Null student exception. Like this. So many of them. So many of them that can come out of this invalid reference, stuff like that. What's an example of a dependency validation exception? Something like already exists record exception. Already exists like this. Already exists. Student exception, something like this, right? Or something like, let's go here, or something like invalid reference exception. Valid student reference exception, like this, right? So invalid student reference exception, right? And there's also something like, let's try this again, something to the effect of, let's see here. There is, let's see, this is invalid, locked student exception. There's so many different types of dependency validation exceptions. and so many different types of validation exceptions that we categorize. That doesn't mean that the dependency exception doesn't have issues too. Like for instance, if you're communicating with a database, you're gonna get SQL exception like this, SQL exception, SQL exception like this. We localize this into something called failed student storage exception, something like this. So localization and then categorization. We pick up a certain exception and we localize it and then we categorize it. So, okay, based on what I just told you, there's some work that needs to happen here. Can you tell what it is?
Categorize it. Localize it, then
Lo
categorize.
localized. This is a categorization.
Oh,
We
that. Okay.
already categorized, but we need something in here that goes and says failed book service exception, like this.
Mm.
And there could be so many other types that we want to take care of. Like for instance, if there is like a something like, you know, we're running out of memory or whatever the case may be, we take that service exception and we turn it into something else. There's so many different things that can happen outside of the service that you can't really do anything about, but to categorize it as a service exception and try again. Makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that means we still have work in here. So here's the deal. The deal here is that we want to modify our existing test in here. Let's go to that test in here. Pro service exception. I want to modify this test to be able to include the localization aspect of our exception handling. What should be the first thing to do? What do you think? Hmm.
Get an instant of that.
Get an instance of
The one that we want to create, the local one.
the localization. Okay, so let's go under exceptions and let's go like this and say, here we go, failed book service exception, right? So this here, I can go here and say inherit from exceptions. And I can go like this and say, this is my constructor. This guy takes an inner exception, whatever that service is, like this. And then we're going to go here and say, failed book service error occurred, contact support. And then we're going to pass in the inner exception. So this is the message that we're saying, hey, something horrible has happened, and we already localized this so far to the point where we go and say, hey, your book service has failed. Go ahead and contact support. What that means is that I can go now and say in my book service exceptions for add, I can go now and say var failed book service exception equal new failed book service exception with the service exception being passed in as an input parameter like this, and now I can go and take that failed book. I can take that failed book service exception in here and pass it in as the book service exception, and I can run my test. Do you think my test is going to pass now? Let's find out.
You delete the other part, yeah?
Which part?
In the book services.
Did I? Yeah,
Uh,
I did.
yeah. So now it should fail. Yeah,
Should
because
fail.
we didn't implement it. Yeah.
Okay, so failed book service exception. And we're going here and we're saying, okay, so now we ran into another problem. What is that problem? The problem here is that when we verify that this service exception has been thrown, we're not really verifying the inner exceptions
Mm.
for this service. That's another problem. How do we solve that problem? We can go up in here and write a very simple function. You'll see this very, very common across all my code base, where I go and say private static expression right? And I'll explain to you what that means in a bit, but here goes the Visual Studio with the new features. Can you just inherit, dude? Oh man. See, Brian was just running into this same problem earlier. Okay. I hope that's not how the final release looks like because that's gonna piss off a whole lot of engineers. Okay. So expression that takes a func, right? And it takes an input of an exception and it throws an output as a boolean. And this guy here will say same exception as, and it will take in an exception here as expected exception. This is your expected. And then we have an actual exception like this, and this actual exceptions we're basically going and saying in here, does the actual exception dot message equal expected exception dot message. Also we want to go and say, does your actual exception dot inner exception dot message equals your expected exception dot message. Are these two things are equal? So this guy is returning that. Let's see here. Why is it complaining? Their message operator. So this guy here is supposed to, give me a second. You do this so many times, but you still need to, okay. So this is, let's see here. So in unit, okay, unit tests. I'm just looking at a very um, nearby code base that I can take a look at just to confirm. Yeah, so this is, yeah, expression, func, exception, boolean, same exception as. Okay, what is this thing tripping about? This is all done. Oh, equal. Okay, there you go. Okay, inner exception, blah, blah. This is all good. Okay. So what is this doing? It's saying when you pass in an exception here, make sure that this exception is the same as that exception. How else we gonna verify this? In software engineering, when your application is running, you always want to log all the events that are happening within your application when it's running. We need to log all the things that are happening within a particular application as it's running. I won't talk about logging now. I will save this for another day. I won't talk about logging now. For now, I will just take this function here, just this function as is, and I will just say this is the same exception as, and I'm just going to return a Boolean in here, Boolean like this, and I will just say, give me my actual versus your expected. This is exception, actual exception like this, and this is your expected exception, just for now.
Mhm.
For now, I'll go ahead and do that, and then we're going to actually evolve this code in a way that will make it very interesting in terms of logging and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, this is all good. Let's go back into our service here, and now we can make this service fail so much so. First of all, this guy returns the actual exception that was thrown. So I can go here and say this is a book service exception, and that's my actual exception. Okay, I got that actual exception underhand. Now, what am I going to do? I'm going to go and say, well, I want to say assert, or let's just go and say same exception as, and here's my actual exception. Here's your expected book service exception should be true. So these two should be true like this.
Mhm.
Now, things should fail. I hope so. Let's see. Oh, wait, why am I putting service exception here? This should be expected book service exception. There you go. And this is actual book service exception, like just like this. Okay, perfect. Let me take those down by one, just to make sure the code is kind of readable. And let's run this again. So now look, I'm gonna get failures, but I want to get the good failures, not the bad failures. So this guy here is failing because it says I expected this exception to be the same, but actually they came back as false. So now I have a failing test that says, wait a second, the inner exception is not correct.
Mhm.
Now, do you want to pull that code over on your side and try to make it pass? Easiest thing in the world. Go for it.
See. Shell control pull. Refresh share screen. You see my screen, right?
I am just about to. Yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh, you went dark mode. Yay. Okay, perfect. Fun. A lot
Right.
easier on the eye. Okay. First of
Yeah,
all, let's make sure our tests are failing. Let's make sure you pulled the right stuff. So let's run this.
I didn't pull.
Should have at least one failing test. Here we go. Okay. Double click on that guy. I'll actually go to the code.
Should-
And we should see failed. Yes, you are in the right place. Wonderful. Now let's make that test pass. What are we gonna do?
Okay. Yeah.
Hmm,
So basically, we should call the one that you just created. So the in
that's right. Let's create an instance of the failed book service exception. Let's do that.
well, or what was the name?
Failed book service exception.
Ed or
Uh,
failed
b- yeah, failed book service exception.
book
Uppercase B, camel case.
service exception.
Okay.
Call to failed book service exception and what was the my oh new and what was the inside you get something to that.
Yeah, what does the test say? Let's have the
Okay.
test tell us what's the story. Is it the exception? Okay, perfect. Then what should we do?
Double check. So please make it this way. After we call it, then we have to do that exception, right?
Right, we throw which exception?
The new one, this fail book, this instance.
I don't know about that. Let's go to the test and see what it says.
Said, oh, it's not the same as this.
No, go to the actual code of the test.
Mm.
Hmm.
Well,
Which exception is being thrown that we accept to be thrown?
fail book service exception is true.
Where does it say that?
Oh no, the one that is drawn here is this one that is not
Right,
included.
right,
I have to compare those, but you said it's not a good idea to put comparison there in a catch.
right. But okay. So the exception that should be thrown is book service exception,
Yes,
right?
right,
Not failed book service exception, book service exception, right?
right, yes, yes.
Okay. But we are already throwing book service exception. If you go back to your implementation,
Mm,
in the
yeah,
implementation here, we're throwing book service exception, then the test should pass then. Well, what do you think? Or maybe we're missing something.
maybe we put the in as a fail book.
Based on what? What made you think we should put the failed book service exception as an input?
That's the internal one.
How did you know that?
Because you created as internal, right?
Go back to the test. Let's go back to the test.
Mm.
So we are comparing this expected book service exception, right? Where is the expected book service exception? Right there, right? How is this guy constructed?
From book service
Mm-hmm.
exception.
Mm-hmm.
Give them the fail book service exception.
That's what it is. That's us going and saying, oh, you're expecting that a book service exception will be thrown with a failed book service exception as its inner exception, right?
We go there and add that. And it here is complaint that you didn't throw.
No, the complaining here is on the same exception as. It's saying your inner is not the same. Your outer is the same, that you did the categorization perfectly, but you didn't do the localization.
So now we go back here. Oh, then I created, right? Let's check. I didn't.
Let's see.
Uh, no, I didn't.
Mm, perfect. Maybe that'll make the test pass. I don't know.
Yes.
Nice. Now you can go ahead and commit with the test name, the thin arrow that says pass. Mm. What was the category of the test about? Was it validation? Was it logic? What was it?
It was exception.
Okay, where is it?
Exception. Yeah, that's I'm so here.
Okay.
Let's see. Close.
Okay. Perfect. Here's an assignment for you. We need to be able to do something very similar to the null book exception and invalid book exception.
Why we need
So
to
so let
find
me so let me ask you this first. If you go into the book service, right, what's missing from what we learned today for null and invalid book exceptions?
oh, we didn't localize. Hold on. Those are localized. No, they are they are local and then they are not categorized.
Ah, so the categorization is what's missing, right? Because they're already localized. They've
Yeah,
been created. You created them by hand.
it
You
is.
didn't create that exception, that's the generic service exception, but null book exception and invalid book exceptions, these are not categorized. Your job is to categorize them under something called book validation exception,
Book
right? A
valid.
book validation exception. So that means you need to write two failing tests
Mhm,
and make them both pass.
mhm.
That makes sense.
Right. And this is for the ad book. Okay.
All right,
Oh,
cool.
perfect. Thank you.
All right, I'll connect with you tomorrow. Thank you, Sally. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Take care. Bye. Bye.